Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Bible study today. We are looking at Psalm 142 today. This one is a relatively short, straightforward psalm, definitely easier to interpret than yesterday's. Before we jump in, if you would like our PDF, you can download it on our website. There's a link down in the description, and it's totally free. This psalm was once again written by David. Now, seems to be before David was a king. We'll talk about how we know that from, in our outline and in our definitions section. And as far as New Testament references, I don't have any for Psalm 142. For our themes today, I've selected the theme of relentless faith during days of discouragement. And then our two words to define are going to be the word maskil in verse 1 and also the cave in verse 1. These are both in the introduction to the psalm. The psalm is described as a maskil of David. What does that mean? We've looked at this several psalms ago, but let's take another look at it. It's kind of an unknown, debated term. The exact meaning of the term maskil is somewhat of a secret. It may have been a musical indicator telling the musician or the performer how the psalm was supposed to be presented. Other people think that the term indicates that it was a psalm that was written to impart wisdom to its hearer or to the reader. And then we have the cave, also in verse 1. This probably refers to one of the caves that David hid in when he was on the run from King Saul, who was trying to kill him. Perhaps the cave of Adullam, which we read about in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. 7 verses make up Psalm 142, and I've got them all under one heading, David in a cave of discouragement. So this psalm follows the pattern of many of David's psalms that we've looked at in the past. He opens it by expressing his problem, the trouble that he's going through. And then he closes it expressing his confidence that God is going to help him deal with that problem. The problem that David was dealing with in Psalm 142 at this time was discouragement. The introduction to this psalm seems to indicate why he was discouraged. It was written during a time seemingly when he was on the run from King Saul. King Saul was trying to kill him for no reason. David hadn't done anything wrong, and yet King Saul was after him, really because he was God's selected next king, and Saul didn't like that very much. So David had to hide in the wilderness and in caves to keep himself alive, and no doubt that wasn't the most enjoyable way to live. David felt like he was alone, like there wasn't anybody who cared about him. His spirit was tired, and he was tired of just dodging the traps that his enemies were putting in his path everywhere he went. He always had to be careful. No doubt that would be pretty tiring. He felt like he was in prison, and his cave in the wilderness probably would have seemed like a prison because he couldn't wander about freely or else Saul might discover his whereabouts. He prayed to the Lord, quote, "Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low," in verse 6. Though he was discouraged, his trust in God never faltered. It's a very David characteristic, and we've seen this a lot in the Psalms. He knew that God was his only source of strength. In verse 5, he wrote, quote, "I cry to you, O Lord, I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." And then he expresses more confidence in the final line of the psalm where his enduring faith is observable again. He expressed trust that God was going to be good to him and that eventually God would surround him with righteous people. So that is Psalm 142. Now let's close with our application for today. David was a man of faith. We know that, and he trusted that God was going to take care of him. But this psalm reveals to us that he wasn't immune to having some hard days. He still struggled to make sense of the enemies that were persecuting him. His soul was still downcast, and there were still times that he felt like he was alone. Having strong faith doesn't mean that life is always going to work out the way that we planned, or that our living situation is always going to be the best, or that we'll never have any questions about why things are the way that they are, or that we'll never wake up feeling discouraged. But faith in God does give us the confidence to do what David did in expressing that while life may have us temporarily beaten down a little bit, God has a hold on us and that everything will be all right in the end. God doesn't promise us that we'll never find ourselves in some dark caves of our own, but he does promise us that he will be with us in those caves and he'll eventually guide us out to better days.